She left our kids alone for 6 hours. She left a cryptic note. And when I followed it to a storage unit across town, what I found wasn't just an affair, it was a paper trail that would turn my divorce into a fraud case. Viewers, before you continue, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories. My name is Fed Nobby. I'm 38 years old, a structural engineer who has spent the last decade designing the bones of buildings across Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of steel and concrete skeletons that hold entire lives inside them without anyone noticing the work underneath. I never imagined that the foundation I should have been watching was the one under my own roof. I have 2 kids, Micah, 8, and Ruth, 5, and a wife named Jessica Fed, the woman I married at 26 because I believed, with the kind of certainty only young love allows, that we would grow old on the same porch. For 12 years I built my life around 2 things, my work and my family, and I told myself that was enough, that showing up every day was the same as truly seeing the people in front of me. That Tuesday in March started like every other Tuesday. I left the office at 5:40, the sky already bruising into evening, and drove the same route home I'd driven 1,000 times, past the same gas station, the same church with the flickering cross, the same turn onto our street where the porch light usually clicked on before I even parked. That evening, the porch light was dark. I sat in the driveway a moment longer than usual, engine ticking as it cooled, telling myself Jessica had probably taken the kids to her mother's for dinner, that there was nothing behind that darkened window except an ordinary, forgettable evening. I want you to remember that feeling, that small, dismissible unease, because looking back now I understand it was the first knock of something enormous, something that had been building quietly for over a year while I was busy believing my life was steady and whole. I opened the front door and stepped into a silence that didn't feel like an empty house at all. It felt like a held breath, waiting. The silence didn't hold long. "Daddy?" Micah's voice cracked from somewhere upstairs, thin and frightened in a way I hadn't heard since he was a toddler afraid of thunder. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart suddenly a fist against my ribs. I found them both in Ruth's room, still in their school clothes, backpacks still buckled, sitting so close together they looked like one shape in the dim light. Ruth was crying without sound, the exhausted kind of crying that comes after a child has already cried themselves empty once and started again. Micah told me, in the flat, careful voice kids use when they're trying to be brave, that Mom had dropped them off for a little while and left. I asked him when. He said right after school. That was over 6 hours earlier. I sat on the floor between them and pulled them both into my arms, feeling Ruth's small hands fist into my shirt, and underneath my own fear I felt something colder rising, a memory I hadn't let myself examine in months. 3 weeks earlier, Jessica had started coming home late from what she called networking events for her consulting business, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, laughing too quickly when I asked how her evening went. I had let it go, the way you let go of a splinter you can't quite locate, telling myself I was imagining things, that trust meant not chasing shadows. Downstairs, I made cereal because it was the only thing I could manage without my hands shaking too badly, and I put on cartoons, and I told my children everything was fine, using the voice parents use when they themselves have no idea if that's true. Ruth finally fell asleep against my arm halfway through the 2nd episode. Micah stayed awake longer, watching me with an expression too old for an 8-year-old, like he already understood something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet, that their mother hadn't just been late. She had left them, and she hadn't left a reason. I found the reason, or the beginning of one, after I carried both kids to bed and came back down to clean up the cereal bowls. A folded piece of paper was sitting under the coffee mug Jessica used every morning, the chipped blue one she'd had since college, and something about that detail, her ordinary mug holding down something so unordinary, made my stomach drop before I'd even read a word. My hands weren't steady as I unfolded it. The handwriting was hers, but rushed, the letters leaning hard to the right the way they only did when she wrote in a hurry or in anger. It said she couldn't do this anymore, that I would understand once I checked a storage unit on Freedom Drive, that she was sorry it had to be this way, signed simply, J. I read it 4 times, waiting for it to make sense, waiting for the version of Jessica I'd built my life around to explain herself in those 2 sentences. She didn't. A storage unit. We didn't own one, had never discussed one, and yet the note spoke of it like something I should already know, like a shared secret I'd somehow forgotten. I thought about every late night, every closed laptop when I walked into a room, every time she'd stepped onto the back porch to take a call and lowered her voice. I had noticed all of it and explained all of it away, because the alternative, that my wife was living a second life beside my first one, had felt impossible. Standing in my kitchen at nearly midnight, the note trembling slightly in my hand, impossible was starting to feel like exactly what this was. I didn't sleep. I called Jessica's phone 11 times before dawn, and 11 times it went straight to voicemail, her cheerful outgoing message playing back at me like a small cruelty. I called her sister next, my voice tight with a calm I didn't feel, and she claimed she hadn't spoken to Jessica in weeks, a lie so smooth I almost believed it, one I'd later learned she'd been coached to tell. Then I called Angela, Jessica's coworker, someone I'd met exactly twice at office holiday parties, and something in her hesitation told me more than her words did. There was a pause, long enough to be its own sentence, before she said quietly that I should probably just wait for Jessica to explain things herself. People don't hesitate like that over a woman who simply needed space. They hesitate like that when they're protecting a secret they never wanted to be handed in the first place. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table replaying the last year in fragments, searching for the moment I'd missed. There had been a weekend trip to visit her college roommate in Asheville that I now couldn't stop turning over in my mind. There had been the new gym membership, the sudden interest in yoga classes that ran until 9 at night, the way she'd started keeping her phone face down even at dinner. None of it had seemed like betrayal at the time. Betrayal rarely announces itself, it wears the ordinary clothes of a busy life, and I had been too tired, too trusting, too in love with the idea of my family to look closely enough. By 6 in the morning, sunlight creeping gray through the blinds, I had made a decision. I dropped the kids at my mother's house, told her only that Jessica and I were having problems, and watched Ruth wave at me through the back window with a small, uncertain hand. Then I drove toward Freedom Drive, toward whatever version of my life was waiting behind a locked metal door, telling myself I was prepared for anything. I wasn't. The storage facility on Freedom Drive smelled like dust and cold concrete, rows of identical orange doors stretching under buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered every few seconds like a nervous heartbeat. Unit 214 was near the end of the hallway. I'd called a locksmith that morning, since I had no key and no idea what I was about to find, and I stood back while he worked, my jaw tight, my mind running through a dozen explanations that all sounded like lies even inside my own head. When the lock finally gave way and the door rolled up, the space inside was smaller than I expected, but full. Cardboard boxes stacked along one wall, labeled in Jessica's handwriting with words like documents and keep. A second phone sat charging on a metal shelf, its screen lighting up periodically with notifications I couldn't yet read. And on top of a plastic bin, almost deliberately placed, sat a manila envelope with my name written across it in the same rushed handwriting as the note. My hands hovered over it longer than they should have, some instinct warning me that once I opened it, there would be no folding this back into the life I used to have. I opened it anyway. Inside was a stack of photographs, and the one on top stopped my breath entirely. It showed Jessica sitting on the deck of a lake house I had never seen in my life, sunlight in her hair, laughing at something just outside the frame, her hand resting easily on the forearm of a man I did not recognize. Behind them, someone had written a date on the back corner in pen. 14 months ago. 14 months, while I was working late shifts to cover a mortgage refinance, while I was tucking our children in and telling them mommy was just running behind, my wife had been somewhere else entirely, building a life with her hand resting on a stranger's arm like it belonged there. I sat down on an overturned bin because my legs no longer felt entirely mine, and I went through the rest of the envelope slowly, forcing myself to look at every page. More photographs followed the first, all of them at the same lake house across different seasons, Jessica's hair shorter in one, longer in another, always smiling, the specific, unguarded smile I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. Beneath the photographs were bank statements, and these were worse than any picture could have been. An account I had never known existed, opened under Jessica's maiden name, showed transfers totaling nearly $60,000 over 18 months, small enough individually to avoid notice, large enough together to explain the tightening budget I'd chalked up to inflation and rising grocery prices. I remembered, with a sick lurch, the conversation 2 years earlier when Jessica announced she was restarting her freelance consulting business, how proud I'd been, how I'd toasted her with cheap champagne in our kitchen the night she said she'd landed her first big client. I had believed every word. I had told my co-workers about my talented wife building something of her own. The client, I now understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass, had never existed. The business had never existed. It had all been a door she'd built to walk through money without me asking where it went, one careful withdrawal at a time, funding a second life she'd been constructing in the exact months I thought we were finally getting ahead. The second phone on the shelf was still charging when I picked it up, and though I had no right to unlock it, grief and fury make their own rules, and I tried Jessica's birthday, our anniversary, Micah's birthday, until Ruth's birthday finally opened it. Inside were messages going back over a year with a contact saved simply as R. I traced him first through a company logo visible in one of his profile photos, a construction firm based 2 counties over, and from there found his full social media presence within the hour, a project manager with an easy smile and a habit of tagging locations. Jessica appeared in his check-ins repeatedly, always on days I remembered clearly as her networking events, the 2 of them tagged at restaurants, at a lakeside cabin I now recognized from the photographs, once even at a jewelry store 4 months earlier. I sat in my car in the storage facility parking lot scrolling through months of evidence with a strange, hollow calm, the kind that arrives after shock has nowhere left to escalate to. One comment beneath a recent photo stopped me entirely. Posted 3 weeks earlier, from Jessica's account, it read simply, "Almost time, ready when you are." 3 weeks. She had been counting down to the night she left our children alone in a dark house, and I had spent that same stretch of time asking her if she was feeling okay, if she needed help around the house, worried I was somehow failing her. Jessica came back 4 days later, not for me, she made that clear within seconds of walking through the door, but for the kids' winter coats, since apparently wherever she was staying didn't have adequate heat. I was standing in the kitchen when she walked in, the photographs and bank statements laid out across the table in a neat, deliberate row, evidence I'd arranged the way I once arranged blueprints, needing to see the whole structure at once. She saw them and stopped in the doorway, coat still on, mascara smudged beneath eyes that looked tired rather than ashamed. I expected her to crumble. I had spent 4 sleepless nights imagining this moment, imagining her breaking down, begging, explaining herself into someone I could still recognize. Instead her face hardened into something almost defiant. "You don't understand what I've been carrying," she said, her voice steady in a way that frightened me more than tears would have. "This marriage was suffocating me. I found someone who actually sees me." I asked her, quietly, how long. She didn't flinch. Over a year of planning, she admitted, though she'd been unhappy far longer than that, years she said I'd been too consumed with work to notice. She told me R. had convinced her the kids would adjust fine without her as the primary parent, since I always handled everything anyway, a sentence that landed like a slap, turning my reliability into the very excuse she'd used to walk away from Micah and Ruth without looking back. She left again within the hour, taking 2 coats and nothing else, and I didn't stop her. Over the following weeks, with a lawyer's help, the full shape of what she'd done kept surfacing in pieces, each one worse than the last. The $60,000 hadn't only funded secret dinners and a double life at a lake house. It had funded a down payment on an investment property 3 states away, in South Carolina, titled jointly under Jessica's name and the man I now knew as Randall, purchased 8 months earlier while she still kissed me goodnight and packed our children's lunches every morning. She hadn't simply been unfaithful in the ordinary, devastating way I might have eventually forgiven. She had been quietly constructing an entire exit, brick by brick, funded by our shared savings, while maintaining every outward appearance of a woman still fully present in her marriage. I remembered her at Ruth's kindergarten graduation 2 months earlier, clapping and crying real tears, and I couldn't reconcile that woman with the one who had already signed her name on a deed 3 states away. My lawyer read through the documents I'd brought her in near silence, then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't expected. "This isn't just a divorce case anymore," she said. "This might be fraud." Rain had started against my kitchen window by the time I got home that night, and I sat alone at the table long after dark, the papers still spread in front of me, understanding for the first time that betrayal had a paper trail, and mine was 18 months long. The custody hearing came 4 months later, and I sat in a courtroom in a suit I hadn't worn since my father's funeral, watching Jessica avoid my eyes from across the aisle. Her lawyer argued exhaustion, mental health struggles, a temporary lapse in judgment, but bank records and a documented pattern of abandonment don't bend to argument, and the judge granted me primary custody without much hesitation, citing clear evidence of financial concealment and the children left unsupervised for hours. Jessica moved to South Carolina within weeks, into the house she'd bought with money that used to be ours, with the man who'd promised her a life that actually saw her. She calls Micah and Ruth on Sundays now. Sometimes they answer, eager and unguarded the way children are with a parent they still love without complication. Sometimes they don't, and I've stopped forcing them to, learning slowly that healing doesn't run on anyone else's schedule, not even mine. Some mornings I still catch myself replaying that Tuesday evening, the dark porch light, the folded note under the chipped blue mug, searching for the exact second I could have seen it coming. I've made peace with not finding one. Betrayal, I've learned, rarely announces itself in advance. It hides in networking events and yoga classes and ordinary Tuesdays, and you only see the whole shape of it once you're standing inside the wreckage. I rebuilt slower than I expected and steadier than I imagined, one school pickup and one bedtime story at a time. Last week I closed an old photo album and started a new one, its first page a picture of just the 3 of us at the beach, sunlight, no shadows waiting at the edge of the frame. What I didn't know then, sitting in that sunlight, was that Randall had done this before, to another family, in another state, and that Jessica was about to learn exactly what it felt like to trust him. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting